Well, I think a lot of people have been expecting this to be rhetoric, but I think today it's no longer rhetoric. It is definitely real. And even though you might say, well, it's only 34 billion, that 34 billion is real and it's hitting actual people in actual companies and is causing actual pain and will cause more pain as this continues to escalate. So even though it's true in the whole global economy, this is relatively small, if you're at the receiving end of these tariffs and counter tariffs, it feels very real to you. And so I think you will start to see a lot of real pain being caused by this apparent rhetoric in the trade war.
We're not seeing any kind of indication that either China or the US, leaders in either country, are willing to back down. So you've got to question where it does end, if that's the case.
It's not obvious where it ends. And I think that's the sort of scary part, is that there's no obvious resolution to this tariffs, counter tariffs, escalation by the US, potential escalation by the Chinese. Normally, we see tariffs at the end of negotiations, but now we're seeing them really at the beginning of the negotiations. And the point, I think, by the U.S., although it's a little unclear, is that this is meant to bring the Chinese to the table. That's not normally how you negotiate. Normally, it's the end, the sort of punishment at the end for failing to negotiate. And so now that you've imposed punishment, how do you get everybody to sit down and negotiate in good faith, having already started the punishment? That's hard to figure out how that gets solved.
Deborah, Martin's got a question for you from Beijing. Martin, come on in.
Yeah, Deb, good morning. Good to talk to you again. You know, as O noted very astutely just a couple of minutes ago, so far no official word or sign that China has hit back as it had been promising, right? Retaliating 25% on $34 billion worth. Why do you think that is? Why the delay?
I think because the Chinese want to make crystal clear that they did not go first. And they want to make certain that the U.S. has, in fact, imposed tariffs and have I think they would argue, a sort of sufficiently long period of time between when the United States imposed tariffs and when the Chinese then responded, so that it's obvious that the Chinese were not exactly blameless, but they certainly didn't start things. They're only responding to what the U.S. began. And if we had had the Chinese go at sort of 12:02 to U.S. response at 12:01, there's the possibility that some Chinese tariffs might have actually been imposed ahead of U.S. tariffs. And I think that would have been a bit problematic for the U.S. For the Chinese storyline. And so I think they're waiting until it's obvious the United States started this first, and then the Chinese were simply responding. So I would expect a Chinese response at some point in the relatively near future here, because the Chinese are not just going to accept $34 billion in tariffs without making some retaliation response.
Okay, Deb, so let's take it forward a step from there. Let's say China does retaliate, and then you've got the president talking about 200, 400 earlier today, talking about $500 billion more of Chinese imports that he could target with tariffs. You know, Michael Yoshikami, a guy who runs his own fund management company and deals with a lot of money, he said, look, right now, 34 billion, it's not really a war, right? But when we get up to 400, 500 billion, that's real money. Then we're talking, and hopefully that'll force both sides of the table to come to a negotiated settlement or solution. My question to you is, back in March, you'll remember this, NPC, when this whole situation first erupted, there were hopes of a negotiated solution. The Chinese side, they've got a deep bench, we know that, a lot of expertise on trade. They simply didn't know who to talk to on the U.S. side. You know, this time around, if it gets bad enough, they do come to the table again. What happens then? The Chinese side seems to be ready. The U.S. side, whether it's Lighthizer, Navarro, or Secretary Ross, basically, these guys are just not on the same page. They have very, very different agendas. What happens then?
I think that's an interesting question. You know, we were in Washington just a few weeks ago and having discussions with people who were at the negotiating table in Beijing. And they said, you know, there was some productive conversations going on, but that the Chinese were very clear. If the United States were to impose tariffs, those conversations were dead. And until those tariffs and the threat of tariffs were removed, there would be no further conversations. And so here we are today, not only with the threat of tariffs, but the actual imposition of tariffs. So all of that previous dialogue is now dead in the water, and it's not obvious, again, At what point do we start having that conversation? It would require, I think, the United States to essentially unilaterally stop having tariffs. That is going to be very tricky because the United States would have to say, I now trust that the process of negotiation can move ahead. We will withdraw our tariffs while we have a dialogue. That will be tough, especially as this continues to escalate and the trust continues to disintegrate between now and then. And as you pointed out, who's going to sit down at that table? What are we negotiating over? Is it the trade deficit? Is it made in 2025 on the Chinese side? Is it Chinese IP theft? Is it Chinese structural orientation? Is it global rules? What is it that we're actually negotiating over? Still unclear. So at some point, the United States has to decide what its objectives are, has to communicate that to the Chinese. They have to build some back channel level of trust sufficient that they both decide to halt what is now apparently an escalating game of tariffs and counter tariffs, so that they could sit down and have a productive dialogue to figure out how to call this whole thing off. And I think that's going to take some time and some effort.
Hey everybody, it's Hadley Gamble from our new CNBC Middle East Bureau in Abu Dhabi. Thanks for stopping by. Now to watch more, you can try one of the videos that just popped up on your screen. And don't forget to subscribe.